I don't see any questions in the chat. Perhaps if people think of questions, they can type them into they can type them into the chat. At this point, I'd like to invite Christopher Johnson, who's the Chief of Staff at TWU, and he serves on the Quakertown Committee. And he's going to share some information. And Christopher, if there is more that you would like to say as far as introducing yourself, please do, sir.
Sure. Can you all hear me? Yes. Okay, good. Just wanted to make sure that I don't start talking. Yeah, thank you. This is always, I learn so much every time I hear different perspectives on this story. There's always new things to learn. I myself am sort of new to Denton. I moved here in 2005 and I started at UNT and then started working for Texas Women's University in 2010. And I would say that during those years, I had many experiences in Quakertown and never knew that the story of Quakertown at all. I actually assumed it was somehow related to that religious movement of Quakers. And so that was the most I ever knew about Quakertown until the fall of 2016, when a graduate student here wrote to the chancellor and she said, I read this book by one of the esteemed faculty here. She wrote a book chapter, Dr. Claire Celine, about Quakertown, and she noted, the graduate student that is, that the building name, what was Brawley Annex, and that President Brawley was one of the chief architects in the Parks Bond issue. And she thought it was not right that we had Brawley's name in a position of honor on the campus. So that's sort of a little bit about my background and how I'm related to this. I'll say, I guess in a kind of the arc of what I'm about to tell you, I use this sort of what, so what, now what kind of framework that I think many theologians use in studying scriptures. And so I'm going to go into the what a little bit more in depth and then move on to the sort of now what, and then later the so what. Once that student wrote to us, Chancellor Phaeton, being that she has sort of a background and being a social justice minded leader, she was surprised to hear in the 2 years that she had been at Texas Women, she had never heard the story of Quakertown before. And she asked me to bring this matter up before the cabinet. So at that cabinet meeting, I learned that pretty much nobody at that, in terms of the leadership at Texas Women's University, knew the story of Quakertown. And so the cabinet recommended that we go ahead and dig deeper and put together a committee of faculty, staff, students, community members, and try to come up with some deeper understanding and some recommendations that we could take to move forward. So we asked, of course, that graduate student, her name's Ann Jensen Smith, to be one of the members of that committee. And being the chief of staff, I also ended up being a member of the committee. And we brought a number of other people together. And so we dug into how other universities have responded to similar situations as the Quakertown story. So we looked at many of them, but a couple of them I'll just kind of resounded with us. One was from Brown University in Rhode Island. President Ruth Simmons was the first African-American president there at the time. And she was faced with this sort of revelation that came out then, that how, you know, Rhode Island and all of its commerce was very connected to slave trading. And how are they going to, the founder of Brown University, John Brown, was actually one of the first people in Rhode Island prosecuted for going against the abolition of slavery as he was continuing to engage in it. And so they did a very sort of academic wrestling with the history there. Again, President Simmons said that nobody acknowledged that this had ever happened. It was not part of any of the curriculum or in any of the tidbits about Brown University. So she wanted at least that part to come out, but she was in a very particular situation as being an African-American woman leading this university, and everybody would say, well, the only reason we're looking at this now is because we have Ruth Simmons as president. And so we definitely looked at some of the things that they recommended. And one of them was to sort of have the university offer a public apology for their slave trading. And of course, you can imagine how difficult that would be for an African-American woman to come out and say, I'm sorry for slavery. It just didn't make sense. And she said it would be very inauthentic, and it was so far removed even from the time of this injustice happening. So they ended up publishing a bunch of papers that eventually acknowledged that role, and they built a small monument on the campus as a kind of memorial to that history. So it hopefully would spark people's interest. Another story of a similar university was Georgetown University. So that predates the story of Brown University actually by more than a decade. And there at Georgetown, the Jesuits founded the university by selling basically 200 men, women, and children to various people around the United States, principally in Louisiana, and used some of the proceeds from that sale to found the university. And so that story, again, had been sort of secret and not talked about. And then in the 80s and 90s, they created a huge historical investigation of that. They created a digital archives about the events and placed them in place in the 1990s. And then if you fast forward to 2015, well, we have Michael Brown murdered in Ferguson, and a number of these stories of murdered Black and Brown people, contemporaries around us, not historical figures. And so that created a lot of energy at Georgetown, protests, town halls, etc. And one of the things that we learned from the President de Goya, was that in all those conversations with the students at that time, almost none of them knew about the Jesuit history, the history of Georgetown's founding, etc. And so he was surprised with all of the work that was invested and put into sort of trying to tell that history, how few people it actually touched and how little difference it made in the day-to-day lives of people. So that's a little bit about what we learned. Now I'm going to move into sort of the now what of this. So what are we going to do with this information? So the committee, first of all, we wanted to set some goals for how we are going to frame our recommendation. One of the goals is that we definitely wanted to acknowledge the university's role in scattering the residents of Quaker through the Denton Park bond issue of 1921. So whatever we come up with, whatever our solution is, that has to be part of it. The second thing we wanted to do was something that could really engage our students and the community more broadly in some experiential learning, and not just one time, but for an extended period of time, rather than a one and done solution. So a lot of the things we looked at in the past, well, let's take our little chapel in the woods, for example. So that's become something near and dear to many in the community and even further around. And part of what made that chapel so special was that there are students and faculty designed elements in that chapel. This, of course, is 2016, not 1938, when that chapel was built. And so we needed to do we wanted to do something that engaged people in the telling of the story and understanding the story, so that it wasn't just a couple of people doing the work and everybody else sitting around watching and not engaging. And we also recognized from the works of Georgetown University that there is sort of no silver bullet or no quick fix. It's not going to be something that's going to solve white supremacy or racial injustice by just doing one thing. It's got to be something that we do where we can deal with feelings of white fragility, where we can deal with social injustice more broadly. And I think as an institution of higher education, it seemed that we would be well positioned to do that in sort of a teaching way, But there's so many pitfalls that we learned from Georgetown. There's so much turnover among students. There's turnover among the students fastest, the administration probably second fastest, and then faculty and staff as well. So how do we take this energy and keep it moving for a longer period of time, so that we can actually make plant some seeds that will grow into something long term? And we wanted to do something that didn't just target Texas women students and faculty and staff, but also something that would help the entire community of Denton. So some of the ideas that we explored were, of course, a university apology. Another one would be removing Brawley's name from the building, as the student originally suggested. Others would be oral history projects or books or films, although as we've heard just now, there's a lot of that was already in the works, and still it didn't have much of an impact on our students, faculty, and staff. We could establish a scholarship program. These are just some of the many things that we consider, but a lot of them didn't seem to fit, it seemed to tick some of the boxes of what our goals were. So then we encountered, and this was something that I've been engaged with TED Talks for quite some time. And in 2016, I was at the conference in Vancouver, and I ran into some of the work of Brian Stevenson and his architect that he had selected, named Michael Murphy, for the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama. And Michael Murphy gave a talk called Architecture That's Built to Heal. And that talk just resonated with everybody on the committee. And we said, you know what, there's so many elements here that they talk about in there. One of them was that the National Memorial for Peace and Justice was acknowledging the racial injustice of Jim Crow, making it very visible, and the thousands of unjustified lynchings that happened in this country. It was experiential. They dug up dirt from the sites of all of those lynchings and placed them in that memorial. So there are people involved in it. And the other experiential piece of it is they created these monuments that are intended to have the counties where these lynchings happened go claim their monument and bring it back to their county and install it, so that it had this sort of pervasive and lasting effect. And of course, visiting it has cathartic elements as well. There are ways of engaging with that memorial. So we wanted to do something that had a kind of a lasting effect like that, where our students could engage in these hard conversations about racial injustice and learn from them, that it would be ever present, something that would last beyond the life of the committee. Although one of our recommendations, I will say, was that the committee would not be disbanded after we turned in our recommendations. And so that we could, keep the momentum and all the work that we had put together as we have turnover on the staff and faculty, that we could kind of have some stability and move that along. And so what we put together as what our recommendation was basically to the chancellor and our cabinet was to build a memorial on the Texas Women's University campus in Denton that would have a space for hard conversations. So this would be, we conceived of this as a sort of theater in the round, or an amphitheater. And the circular nature of it creates this idea that everyone's voice is equal in this conversation space. And that was very important. We were actually dealing at that time with a lot of anti-Semitic things happening on campus. We had, of course, many different murders committed across the country of Black and brown people. And there was bombings in Charlottesburg, or not Charlottesburg, but the mosque, and the Jewish temple. And so there was just a lot of unrest, and still is actually. And so this would be a place for those conversations to happen. So we wanted that to be part of it. And then we wanted a surrounding garden that would have symbols from Quakertown that would help tell the story, so that students could engage in learning about the story by walking through. And our idea also was to have the students contribute. So it wouldn't just be a static memorial, but it would have a living component to it. So we would use augmented reality, which is this technology with your phone, so that you can sort of point it at different objects and you could read what that object represents. And we could have poems, we could have oral histories, we could have all sorts of different elements that students would contribute on an ongoing basis, not just one time, to having them therefore engage in that story. So that is the seed of the idea. We realize there's, of course, no perfect solution. There's no way to undo the harm that has been done. But we think that if there is ever going to be any solution, it's going to have to be one that lasts a long time, and that engages people in the work of learning about the truth, and trying to bring their experiences in to understand how their story can fit in with the Quakertown story. And so we don't think that this is the end all. In fact, it wasn't the end. This was the beginning. We proposed this to the cabinet, and they accepted this as a recommendation. And then after making that proposal, we also asked for a second thing later, and that was to remove Brawley's name from the building. See, if we are concerned with removing Brawley's name immediately, is that it would happen in a matter of a month or less, and no one would ever know it. It would be, and it's now that building is renamed the Service Annex. So that building's called the Service Annex, and how many people are going to benefit from, of course, we do agree that not having his name in the position of honor is the right thing, but it's not a lasting thing. It's not something that will be educational. So we did get that accomplished, and we think there's other things that can be accomplished the more broadly people learn the Quakertown story. And so we're hoping to tell that broadly. Since then, we also have a faculty group that has gotten together and achieved this grant from the National Endowment of the Arts, $100,000, where they train other faculty members to teach this story, because it's not an easy story for people to teach. And sometimes they don't know the words or the ways to engage in that pedagogy. And so this is a professional development opportunity that they've been using to help the faculty in teaching that story. We're also, there's a small component of the Quakertown story being taught to all of our first time in college students in the freshman seminar, which we have called University 1221. So that's sort of the what we've done, what we're trying to do. And so the so what is that I think we're going to really engage people so this is where our goal is to actually have this finished by the end of 2022. That would mark 100 years since the forced relocation. And this would occupy, we've selected a location on campus of about 5.5 acres on the east part of our campus in what used to be our golf course. And so it has those elements that I described. It has the amphitheater, it has the walking path with cathartic elements in it. And we're still in the process of designing it. I don't have any, well, we're very much engaged with the architectural firm that's working on it. In fact, they're going to be on site here in a couple of weeks, collecting even more information and vetting their ideas with us. But anyways, that's where it's going, and I hope that it will have some of those lasting tributes. It's really hard to get our students off campus to engage in things like the Selby House and the other components that we've seen done in Denton. And so this that we're hoping is something that's close to home, so it'll be an ever-present reminder of that history, and will be a space where we can engage in that. So I'll end there, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
And Christopher, there are a couple of questions that have just popped up in the chat.
Sure. Do you want to ask them to me, or do you want me to open the chat?
Oh, would you be willing to open the chat?
Let's see here. Yes. Okay.
It's
Okay, so I see one here. How about renaming the building in honor of a family from Quaker? Okay, so that's a great idea, which is one we also had. So this Brawley Annex, what used to be called, is also one of the smallest, most inconspicuous buildings on our campus, and one that probably doesn't have a long history. And we thought, well, do we name a building like that after somebody from Quakertown? We think instead what we're wanting to do is put every single name of every family who was displaced from Quakertown in part of this monument. So all of those names will be present, and we won't have to just pick one. So that's our solution to that. Let's see what else. Who is creating the memorial, and are they of color? That's a great question. We have had that challenge a lot. So this committee that I'm on has 2 Black people and 1 Hispanic, well, 2 Hispanics, sorry. So yes, it definitely has more of a white presence on it. But I would also say that there's, Michelle Alexander wrote this book, The New Jim Crow. And then the final chapter of that book, she says, the work is not for Black people to do. The work is for white people to do. Now, yes, it's not supposed to be a whitewashed history. That is a concern that one might have. But we've really got to engage white people in changing. That's where the work needs to be done. And so having white leadership on a change like this is not, I don't think, undermining the value of it. In fact, it could actually be more of what needs to happen in terms of process. But yes, the architectural firm has people of color on it. In fact, it's not just a firm. So there's the HKS is the name of the architectural firm, but then they have partners with a group called Main Street that's working. They have done many museum installations before, so they're working on the narrative components of it, which I will also say we are trying to minimize those narrative components because the stories are out there. That's not the problem. So what we're really wanting to do is spark an interest in some of the facts, and then let students dig in deeper into the stories that are out there. Let them go visit Quakertown Park. Let them go visit the restored houses in the off Mulberry. So and so there's Main Street. There's also Tanaik, which is the landscape architects. So there's many different hands in this, and throughout we're trying to vet this also with experts. So we have Southeast Denton residents who we are using as consultants for some of these vetting of these plans, etc. So yes, we want to definitely make sure that the people who are displaced, the stories aren't inaccurate, but we don't necessarily aren't asking for the people of color who were displaced to do the work to make this happen. Okay, let's see. There's so many questions. Architectural charter.
There's two that are about reparations. To what extent has Texas Women's University, or Alma and Karen may answer if they know, or the City of Denton talked about, besides telling these stories, what else could we do that's more action oriented? And so maybe, I don't know if Alma and Karen want to jump in after you talk about that.
Sure. So reparations was something that we talked about in our committee for a great period of time. In fact, creating a scholarship was sort of one of the first things. There's a lot of challenges with doing that, particularly how do you use state funds, which we're a public university. We're not like Georgetown or Brown. We don't have private funds. So how do we use state funds to do this? In fact, we cannot use state funds even to build this memorial. The memorial has to be raised by private funds. And so while the amount of private funds that we're using to build this memorial are not as significant as the amount we would have to raise to do scholarships. But then on the other part of scholarships and even reparations in general, how do you set up a system that also limits the recipients of those scholarships? So verifying that what's the cutoff in terms of being a descendant, et cetera, et cetera. So and then what do you do to those who already? So some descendants have already gotten their degrees from Texas Women's University. How do you pay them back? But how do you justly do that? So there was a lot of issues with that. What I did say earlier is that we don't think that this memorial is the end of it. We think that this is the beginning, and there could be ways of building more support for the idea of reparations or a scholarship. But until we have more interest or vested understanding of the situation, was just too much of an uphill battle, and we weren't able to take that on by ourselves. And in terms of our relationship with the City of Denton, yes, we have one. But it's again something we would entertain, doing more with City of Denton to see how they could engage in something further. Okay, I think that answers it. Is there another one related to that you had? Are reparations a broader topic than simply scholarships? Yes, they are. I think this is going to take some leadership more broadly than the university for conversations about reparations. But where can we do something? And as our mission allows us, we can do things in education, and one of the ways of doing education is through scholarships.
Alma and Karen, there's been a couple questions that are about education on like the K-12 level. So someone asked if that book that you talked about, that somebody also mentioned in the chat, the novel, is taught in our schools. Do you happen to know that? And Jill just asked, who in Denton ISD is TW working with, or are there other links with Denton ISD and Quakertown history that you know of?
Well, the only way the Courthouse Museum, who does the tours, knows which schools have read them is if they want to come and take the White Lilacs tour. And before the pandemic, what's the school on Congress? Calhoun.
Calhoun.
Read it and came, walked to the historical park and the civic center park, the civic center, Quakertown Park, and took the tour. And so I know that they read it. I don't know what other middle schools in Denton read it. There is a middle school in Plano that comes all the way from Plano every year, other than the pandemic year, to take this tour.
Then we have some schools that come from Louisville also that takes the tour.
Jill also had a question. There's a couple questions about people outside of TW. So as you shared in the history, Alma and Karen, that this was not just TW did this on their own, but this is a collaboration between people who are invested in white power in the city for a variety of different economic and cultural reasons who displace these people. And so what do you know, or are there ways that we are as a city looking at the part that citizens of the community played beyond TW as an institution?
Not that I know of. But I will say that Ollie, the retired, I don't know what to call it, lifelong learning at the university, UNT, that is for 55 plus, has classes, and I've taught this Quakertown class several times to people who take the Ollie classes, and most of the people are either have lived in Denton and didn't know anything about Quakertown, or a lot of people move into Denton and discover Ollie and discover that class and want to know more. And so through Ollie, the word is getting out. The story is getting out of what happened.
There's I think a really great question. There's a lot of good questions coming in. So if Chris and Alma and Karen, if you're seeing questions in the chat that you want to address, please just jump in and do it. But Beth had a question, Chris, and I would say also for Alma and Karen. Hello, thank you for your leadership in instituting recognition and healing the century-old injustice. How can those in attendance today who are community members be of assistance to this initiative? So both what you do in the historical side and what Texas Women's University is doing for some of those of us who are community members, but maybe don't have an institutional affiliation with Texas Women's University, what part can we play?
Well, I would say, you know, visit the site when we have it constructed, visit the other sites that are available in Denton and learn and tell the story, have those conversations. There's lots of great books out there, one called White Fragility, that if you're a white person and you have a hard time talking about racial injustice, that's a great place to start, because it can be hard. It is not something that you just wake up one day and do. You have to practice it, you have to engage with it. And there's so many histories. The Warmth of Other Suns, we heard earlier about the Great Migration. Learn about that Great Migration. Learn about the author of that book also recently wrote The Caste, which is another fabulous book that really helps you understand the way that we differentiate people, even sometimes of the same race, as in India, and kind of create injustices through you know, the way we look, the way what class we're born into, etc. So those are some of the ways. I will also just add, in this sort of a way that, as I mentioned, this is not we're not using public funds to build this monument on campus. And so there was a question I saw up here as I was reading through that said, why not raise money for the scholarships instead of building a monument? And that is definitely a valid question. One of the answers to that is that we have to raise a lot more money. And the other answer to that is that this is not the end, but the beginning. So I would hope that as we invest and we are able to raise funds for this and build this project out, that it would be an opportunity for more people to learn, and then perhaps with that greater breadth of understanding and interest and concern about this, perhaps we could raise enough money for something bigger in the future.
I also say that they could visit the Quakertown house, because when you visit the house, you will have an opportunity to actually see the homes and many of the people that were there in Quakertown. So make an arrangement with the county to set up a tour, or just go individually. And while you're at the house there's a box. You can always leave a wonderful donation in the box there. It's a small house, but the house tells the story. And you'll actually see homes, schools, and churches, and they'll tell you a little bit about the people. Quakertown, according to my husband, had a population of almost 300 people, and there were about at least 290 plus buildings.
I would like us, I'm watching. I'm watching the clock, and I'd like to move us on, if I could, to our final presentation, Lenny McAdams, and then hopefully after that there'll be time for questions at the end. But I don't want to shortchange our final presenter. Lenny, are you ready?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Please proceed, my friend. Oh, I should do what I did. Lenny McAdams is a longtime community activist in Denton, and she is the first Black person elected to a citywide city council position. You were the at-large position 5 council person. Is
No,
that
it was
correct?
six.
No, 6. Okay, my error.
And it was a Black woman. A man had been elected previously, but not at large.
Not at large. Yes. So the importance of the at large is you were elected by the entire voting population of the
That is
city
correct.
rather than just people from one district. And you're going to broaden the discussion beyond Quakertown and speak about your life growing up as a Black person in the city of Denton and in Denton County in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s.
Yes. I'll just tell you all, first of all, I was born in 1938, so I'm now 83 years old. So I've been around a long time. I was actually born in Dallas. I moved at a very early age our family moved to Lake Dallas. Let me tell you, Daddy worked as a handyman on people's property. Usually it was acreage of some size. I can't judge exactly because I was so young at the time, but he worked there. Mother was a homemaker. She didn't work outside the home. There were finally born to her 8 children. So I had many brothers and sisters, but ours was a different kind of a life. It was, we were isolated. So we were our family and our neighbors and our whatever. It was just us and whatever family owned the property that my father worked for and on. Anyway, we moved to Lake Dallas when I was fairly young. And while we were living in Lake Dallas, as a matter of fact, it was on a large piece of property that sits exactly opposite to the south of the palatial place that was built and modeled after a French chateau in Lake Dallas. The Ord, I think. Anyways, right across the street from there is where we lived. And driving by our house each day was a lady who's a teacher. Her name was Gocher. And it was too far back for me to discover much about Miss Gocher after I realized what an important part she played in our lives. Because as she came by our house and saw us out in the yard, she realized she was a school teacher, and she realized there was no Black school around anywhere, and that we were of age to go to school, but obviously we were not going to school. We were in the yard when she went in the morning, in the yard when she came back in the evening. And so she stopped one day and offered my mother, she said, "I'll bring you books from my school library if you would read to your children, if you would like that." And fortunately, Mother said yes. And so Mrs. Gocher proceeded to bring books. And I like to say, I had 2 older brothers. They sat on the right and left and looked at the book. I sat in front of my mother and looked at the book upside down. So for a long period of my life, I could read easily upside down, which it was a long time for it. Discovered that not everybody did that. But at any rate, Mrs. Gocher, that was a small thing that she did. But in fact, it was, I think now, what would the parents of those children going to that school have thought if they had realized that those books had been in our hands at some point or other and back and forth to the library? She could have been in a lot of trouble. And so I think it was bravery of her, but it was obviously a woman who followed what she believed was the right thing to do, even in the face of some danger. Anyway, I learned to read. And when Daddy brought home old books, magazines, newspapers, whatever, I read everything that came through the front door, all the way from murder mysteries, true crime, romance, everything. I read it. Somebody, most little girls were reading Nancy Drew. Somebody gave us a copy, a full edition of the Hardy Boys. So I read the Hardy Boys, was very familiar with Frank and Joe, and I forget the other one name now. But I just really, I didn't have anything else to do. We were there. We did our chores and things like that, but there was no one around. So we just had each other, and I had lots of time to read. We moved to Roanoke in Denton County. Oh, Lake Dallas, we were in Denton County. We moved to Roanoke. It was just a rural area. It's in what is now South Lake. And we moved there when I was 10 years old because Mother had learned that there was a one-room school for Black children in that community. And thus far, I was 10 years old at the time. My brothers were older, and we had not set foot in a school. So she encouraged Daddy to move us over there so that we as children could go to school. It was a one-room school, so we had a variety of classes from the first grade up through, I guess, sixth grade, or maybe even farther than that, I'm not sure. But I went there for 2.5 years. And as you can imagine, I had a lot of catching up to do, but because I was a rather voracious reader, that was my entertainment. So it's what I did. And I caught up rather quickly. And in a one-room school, that's facilitated by the fact that you hear the other students tell about what they do. And so when it's your turn, you've already learned all that they've said. At any rate, we went there for 2.5 years. Then Denton and Tarrant County had one of them, we were very close to the line. One of those was going to have to pay to transfer us because some of those children were now of age to go to junior high and high school. And they simply couldn't provide that level of education. So fortunately for us, the people who made the decision decided to send us to Fort Worth, which was heads and shoulders above the Black school in Denton. I have to tell you, it was just much, much better. We got, well, we had a bookmobile for one thing, which I loved. I mean, a bookmobile, they brought the books to the school on the bookmobile. I got to walk up down the aisle and pick things out that I wanted to read. It was wonderful. When I later got married and moved here to the city, I got up one morning and I told my husband, I said, I think I'll go to the library today. Whereupon he said, oh, you can't go to the library. Blacks aren't allowed to go to the library. He said, if you want a book, you go to the high school and you tell them what you want, and they will order it from the library. And in a couple of days, it'll be over here, and then you can go to school and pick it up. And I said, but I don't know what I want. I need to walk down the aisles and look and see what I want. I mean, it was just an affront to me. How do you expect anybody to use a library when you have to know what you want and ask for that particular book? Anyway, in 1957, when I moved here, fortunately for me at the time, Denton was divided so that there were four voting areas, precincts. And in our precinct was Alex Dickey III and Alex Dickey Jr. Alex Dickey Jr. worked at North Texas. I'm not sure, I don't recall what Alex Dickey Jr. did, but no, Alex Jr. Dickey worked there. I'm not sure what Alex Dickey III, what he did at the time, but he taught us everything you needed to know about voting. He was very active in politics and taught us how to hold a precinct convention and how to get there early and how to shut the door exactly at 7 o'clock if that was the time for the meeting to begin. And that way, anybody who didn't get there early, they were left out, and you couldn't be overrun by the people who were against you in that way. So we virtually controlled, not that it did us any good, but we controlled our precinct and we learned a lot. I got involved in the Kennedy campaign, but most of my friends, the people that I met after I came here and who remain friends to this day, those that are not already dead, were faculty at the University of North Texas. Many of those people were simply wonderful, whereas they talk about the town gown split, and the town didn't do anything for us as far as Black people go. And when I was a member of the Interracial Fellowship and we wanted this place they'd moved us to, and where I had to live when I came here, were unpaved streets, a lack of sewer, a lack of enforcement of codes. It was just, you were just out there and you didn't get any help from the city, frankly. And when I later on, I applied for a job at the city hall, and they increased the requirements for the position after I applied to a level which they didn't have anybody working down there in the clerical section that typed or took shorthand at that rate. Those people worked in Dallas and made big money, not here. But Denton just did that to keep from having to interview me. The city of Denton never, ever acknowledged my application for employment and never interviewed me. I was on a committee with, when they finally decided to integrate things, I was on a committee with Warren Whitson and Irv Bailey from More Business Forums and some others, including the man Hawkins, Reverend Hawkins was minister of Mount Pilgrim CME Church at the time. At any rate, they wanted to talk about this great thing about getting Blacks into restaurants. It was going to be like a holiday, and you were going to plan it all, and you were going to notify people that they were coming and make a big deal out of somebody coming to eat out in a restaurant the first time. Well, I didn't think that was what great shakes. I said, it won't do you any good. You don't have any money. You can't get a decent job in this town. So what we need are job opportunities. Whereupon Irv Bailey said, well, the problem with that is that the students that graduate from Fred Moore High School have what's equal to about a 7th grade education, and they can't pass our test. I told him something about the Mickey Mouse test I was sure they had from all the people that they had down there, and whatever it was, I could pass it. But that was youth talking, even though I could at the time. But it seemed to me that what we needed were jobs, not going into the restaurant. The restaurant would court us when we had money, but we didn't have any yet. And I wanted us to focus on getting jobs. That was a long time coming. And I must say, that involved people from the city. The community was the city as opposed to the university. And there wasn't any push from the community. Irv Bailey hired me at More Business Forums, the first Black they had there working in anything other than the little coffee shop. But there was still no push to hire Blacks, to give them positions. And it just never came. The university did the Women's Interracial Fellowship. Most of them were faculty or faculty wives. So the involvement of the university has been large in my life and contributed to the city, but there was always a talk about the town gown split. The town didn't seem to want the university people telling them what to do. I even remember when there was a group from the city that sort of ran things in terms of the elections. And I remember when a little group of professors from the University of North Texas plotted and took it over by simply, it was a meeting and they turned out many more people than the townsfolk thought they had to have. And they nominated their own people and just obliterated the standing committee, the one who had ruled everything before. But again, the city, people living in the city were just doing nothing. The people who worked with us to get the streets paved, almost all of those were faculty related and faculty wise. When I finally was able to buy a home, nobody would sell to me. George Hopkins, who was a prominent attorney at the time, I later served on the city council with his wife, but at the time he was developing Hopkins Hill. Friends of mine, also from the university, were living over there at the time and wanted me to buy the lot next door to them. And Bill thought it would be all right because George knew who I was. And he said, well, I'll just ask him, which he did. And when he didn't get an answer back, he said, I'm not going to let him get away with just not answering me. He's going to have to tell me that he won't sell this lot to you. And he did. But again, knowing the University of North Texas people, I had so many friends there that one of my friends lived on Kendall and had bought the lot across the street from her. And she sold it to me for a house. That was my very first house in Denton. And I still live on Kendall Street. I've lived here a couple of times. And in 3 different houses, but I'm really happy. And I always think of this as a special neighborhood because when nobody else was interested in trying to do anything, there was no move on the part of the people in the city to help out, to take under advisement some changes in the rules and regulations or whatever, to get Black people hired, to get Black people to a decent place to live. You know, we were criticized as Blacks for always owning a fancy car, but you could get a loan for a car. A car dealer was just happy to sell you whatever car you wanted because he always knew you could come and get it back if you didn't pay for it. But buying a house was a different matter. Even if we could afford it, nobody wanted to sell you a lot in their neighborhood. And Lord knows nobody wanted to sell their house to you and have all the people who were their neighbors previously realize that they had integrated your housing area. So even, with all of the ugly things that were done, and one of those, you know, the fact that the education was substandard at Fred Moore, I have to lay that at the door of the citizens of Denton because it was their school system. They controlled it. And while they thought that was fine for the Black kids, when schools integrated and they closed down Fred Moore, I asked the school board if they would, instead of closing Fred Moore, make it a middle school so that all students came there for at least a year, but just a year, didn't have to go 2 or 3 years, just one. They wouldn't even entertain the idea. And where were the citizens of Denton, good citizens who elected those school board members and all, where were they to support us? Nowhere to be heard from, nowhere. And I can't imagine that it was simply lack of knowledge. It was lack of caring. They just didn't care. And, so I'll always be grateful to the University of North Texas and its people, and to TWU. Kudos to TWU because that's where I went to get my training so that I could finally get a job. And I had a wonderful, wonderful professor, Glenda Simmons, and I give a shout out to Glenda. She's retired now, but at any time, because she was wonderful, I took night classes and she was a teacher and she was just absolutely wonderful and most supportive. As a matter of fact, I was the only Black in the class. I hadn't thought of that before. By that time, I had gotten used to being in surroundings where I was the only one. Let's see, what else can I tell you? Maybe, you know, the thing that my daughter was able to go to kindergarten. Finally, there was a kindergarten that would accept her. But my son, who was older, he did not have that opportunity, though he advanced well when he was in school. But, you know, I wanted to move out of Southeast Denton, not because I wanted to get away from the people there or anything, but I wanted a house like everybody else, one that was habitable and that was in a good neighborhood where the streets were paved and guttered and where the trash was picked up. When I lived in Southeast Denton, part of the time there was a lot next to me that somebody used for stacking old lumber. And when I approached the city to try to get them to move it, because obviously it didn't meet code, and they did things like schedule a hearing on it, and then they would postpone the hearing and not notify me. I was working at the Civil Defense Center at the time. So I would take off and drive in from work only to be told, oh, that was put off until next time. And then I did that again before they ever finally realized I was going to come as often as necessary to get it done. And then they had him move that lumber. But we just wanted a neighborhood like everybody else. Not anything special, just like everybody else. And we wanted to be paid for our work and paid a living wage. But there were so many people who helped me along the way. I can never say enough about that and the gratitude I feel for those people who gave me a helping hand when I needed it. I just think that in Denton, unfortunately, the general citizens, frankly, don't do enough. When rules are passed, laws passed at City Hall or wherever, the people elect those people who make those decisions. And if they would elect somebody else when the first ones they elected passed bad laws and didn't provide services for the Blacks, then pretty soon it would have happened. But they just didn't do that. Everybody seemed to be concerned about their neighborhood. Nobody was concerned about the Black neighborhood. And, you know, people, when it came to zoning, people would say things like, well, that nice new service station will look a lot better than that old shabby building that was there before, and plunk it right in beside somebody's house. The rules just didn't apply to us to protect us, so we could have a decent neighborhood as they did with others. At one time, we couldn't even get the paper thrown in our area. It was deemed too dangerous. And that neighborhood was never dangerous. But they just didn't choose to deliver newspapers to Blacks. What we really need, we need to tell stories of what has happened and how we got here. But more than that, we need every citizen to, when they vote, to think about, what do I want? And think about the other people and what do they want and what do they deserve? What do they have a right to, just like I do? It's not a matter of what is right and fair, but not separate and equal, but because it's always unequal. We want the same things that everybody else wants, and standing on the sidelines while the world moves forward doesn't do your part. You're here and you have some responsibility as a citizen to do something. That Quakertown story could have gone all these years without anybody ever knowing about it, because obviously some people knew about it all along. I mean, all those people that were involved in that, they didn't just die. They were still around for a long time, but it was just something they didn't talk about. And that marker in the civics, by the Civic Center, it's an abomination that you could put that up and call it somehow recognition of what happened. That is disgusting. But they fought tooth and nail not to put anything real on there. You couldn't say anything bad. I'm sorry, bad things have happened. They just did. And until we decide to get more involved, not just talk about it, but do something about it. Object when something is done that is not right for somebody else, not just yourself, but when you see, it's just like they say, when you see something, say something. That goes for race also. When you see discrimination, say something. The Interracial Fellowship women had little stickers that they could put on their check. It was called a good neighbor policy. And I don't remember the exact wording, though I have it in my camera somewhere, but it told you that when you accepted their check, they indicated that they would be happy to be served by a person of color at any time. It would not bother them at all. So hoping that they could persuade business owners to be more open to hiring Blacks, which is the real problem. It's the hiring, and then we've got to live together. We've got to have free sale of housing, not discriminating, because as long as we live separately and in these little enclaves that nobody cares about, and they don't enforce the laws and they don't protect you or anything else, when you're left to live over there by yourself under those circumstances, the children grow up differently. They live in a different atmosphere. They can learn hate much easier when they're separated from others. We need to have open housing, open neighborhoods, and people need to advocate for that. And until we do, we're in danger of losing the very democracy that we all say we cherish. And on that line, I'll close.
Thank you so much for sharing your story, Lenny. And a lot of people in the chat are thanking you for this and noticing how this relates maybe to some of what we've already talked about. And so I have two questions for you, and I encourage everyone to go ahead and add some questions in the chat for all our presenters. After this, we'll open up the Q&A for everyone, and even also allow our presenters to talk to each other if they want to. But Lenny, Sheer has a specific question. What kind of health and medical services were available to you as a child in Denton County and Denton? And then after you answer that specific question, I would just like to ask you to reflect a little bit on what the effect might have been on Denton when you were a young adult if they hadn't displaced so many professionals and the thriving community of Quakertown.
Okay, as to medical care, as with many poor Black families, we didn't go to doctors. The first time I went to a doctor was when I had to get vaccinated to go to school. When I moved to Denton, they had a over on, I think it was on Elm Street, there was a little clinic over there. The Blacks went in one door and there was just this closed room, no windows, nothing. And they would come after a while, after you'd been in there a while, walking around, and they'd come and raise up this little window and see what you wanted. But you know, you were really made to feel very unwelcome and like you were a bother, and you didn't want to go there. So it was some time. In fact, I once, with the complicity of my physician, who was William Williams, He's dead now. And I needed to go into the hospital for some kind of procedure, but whatever it was, it wasn't, there was nothing urgent about it. I made 3 trips to Flo Hospital to check in because I insisted on being admitted to a room other than that 4-person, whatever, that they put every Black in the basement. There were 4 beds in that room, and there was one for women and there was one for men. And they were getting Hill-Burton funds, which were government funds. And I knew they were not supposed to do that. And so when I went out there, when they assigned me a room, I told them, no, thank you. I'll come back next week when there's somebody has more people have checked out and maybe got more room. You'll have another one. When I came back second time and did that same thing, nope, not going in there. I got to have another room. I noticed in the paper at that time in the newspaper, they printed the admissions and the dismissals. And I said, I noticed in the paper that a mighty lot of people checked out. I can't believe they suddenly all those beds are full. It was when I came back the third time, they finally put me on in a wing where they put contagious people, but at least it wasn't in that basement room. But there have been many things like that, and I've been fortunate enough to have support from many people in positions of some power. So that, because I couldn't have done that without the support of my doctor. But he was wonderful. He was very supportive, and I was able to just go, nope, no, not this week, no. And I've forgotten what your other question was.
My other question was, what do you think the effect might have been if they hadn't displaced, for example, the Black doctor who was in Denton and other people who are in Quakertown? Would that have had an effect on your life as a young adult in Denton County, having that thriving community?
Well, one of the things that I think we often talk about Quakertown and what a thriving community it was, and indeed it was at that time. But what was going to happen as they moved on and funneled the money into the white community and not the rest of it? Because that's what happened in Southeast Denton. They wouldn't pave the streets. They didn't want to extend the sewer service, water service, nothing. And then they didn't enforce the codes. And so Quakertown might very well have finally faltered simply because of that.
All right, what other questions? There's some in the chat, but I don't know, I didn't ask Chuck, but if you want to have a short question that you unmute yourself for at this point, I think that we would be fine by that. There's people saying thank you to all the presenters, people talking about ally training. Karen McCormick is talking about TW and UNT do ally training for LGBT people. Maybe we need to think about how white people need to be better allies. Lenny, you were talking about that's something that has both helped you and you've seen the need for that. People just turning
Yes.
their back on things.
People have been wonderful on many occasions to me. But there have been enough ugly parts. In fact, I finally was working, got to be such a hassle, and I was treated so badly for so long. I developed a heart condition, which since I've been retired has gone away, and fine now. But the people who were supportive of me, I can't say enough about them. They were wonderful, and they were the ones who, in effect, saved my life and enabled me to go ahead and do the things that I have done to try to get better services and better living conditions for all Black people.
Well, I guess we're at the point, kind of last call for questions. While you're thinking about that, if you look at the chat, I have posted, it's a couple up now, about the event TWU has this coming Tuesday. So if you go into the chat and copy that, if you might be interested, that's going to be both in person and virtually. And Marcella, are there more questions that are coming in?
Not yet. If any of you have more questions.
What about comments? Ask them if they have comments. I'd be interested in their comments.
Maybe especially about that question about, you know, as an open-ended question to all of us, but what can/should we do, right? Knowing this and being members of this community.
Don't all speak at once. That's what the teacher used to say.
I just want to say that this discussion has been very eye-opening and confirming in realizing that African Americans have been treated likewise in other communities as well. Can't believe my experiences in my little small hometown community is also reflected here in Denton in the way that Ms. McAdams has shared. So thank you for opening up and telling your truth and the reality of racism. So I see this not as university responsibilities alone, but it is surely a citywide initiative that has to be addressed with fidelity and true commitment from the participants to turn our community into one that loves and respects what each individual brings to the table, regardless of color. But thank you all of you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Val. Well, if there, I see some comments thanking folks, looking for some transparency from the Chancellor of TWU, and I believe Christopher said that that was the case. It was going to be an open process.
I think it's rather interesting that we finally had to get a professor from another country to be president of TWU when it changed its direction. It does not speak well of us as the all-powerful US.
Do any of our presenters have questions or comments for each other that you'd like to share? You know, maybe if there's something you heard or you wanted to respond to each other.
Yeah. As for TWU, what I was thinking, they have now I don't know how they pay for these, but they have the Jane Nelson lectures and some other lectures that involved inviting some noted person in to speak. And I think that would be a great thing to do for the Quakertown lectures, if we could have that sort of thing. And then they could invite in a speaker who would address some of the current social problems, whatever they might be at the time, to the community as a whole. That way it would keep going.
Yeah, that's a great idea. The College of Arts and Sciences does have the public forums that they put on at least once a semester, and we've invited speakers about so many things, from wrongful incarcerations, from from the border situation with children in cages, and a lot of these are actually, they don't require very much money to support those lecture series. Some of the bigger speakers for the pop lecture series, that does require a lot more of an investment, but the Public Affairs Forum is actually a really great space where we've had so many conversations with a lot of student attendance. So I think that's a great idea. We can do more. Maybe I'll suggest that to the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences to think about including Quakertown as one of the topics for the Public Affairs Forum.
And some outreach to the city other than just the students. I know that's hard now that we don't have a newspaper. I mean, effectively we don't, because it's online and you can't pick it up in your hands. But to inform the city as a whole, kind of somehow, if you could better publicize those lectures, because I'm delighted when I get a note about them. And the most recent one where you had the lady pilot, it was wonderful. I kept telling people about that later, and they said, well, how'd you get on the list to get a notice about that? I said, I don't know, but I am, and I'm glad.
Yeah, marketing is the hardest thing. It's very expensive, but at the same time, it's part of the value of the experience. So we'll have to look at different ways of making those things more visible. Thank you.
Lenny, David has a question. She said, when you mentioned the current memorial is an abomination at Quakertown, were you speaking of the artwork at the Civic Center or the placard or both or something else? Could you say a little bit more about that if we have time?
That thing with the writing on it that says it's supposed to be in recognition of what happened to Quakertown, and barely touches it and doesn't own up to what you actually did. It makes it sound as if the people in Quakertown just voluntarily moved because the city wanted to build a park. It doesn't touch on the fact that they were forced out, that they had no choice.
When I heard, I don't know, remember where I heard you say that very thing, I went to the park and read it, and I was surprised that they didn't own up to what happened.
We can't hear you.
Well, I don't know why. I'm unmuted.
Now we hear you now. Go ahead.
Okay. I went to the park after I heard you say that comment about a week ago, and read that placard, the state historical marker. And I was surprised too that they had no recognition of the significance of making Quakertown leave.
It isn't there.
No.
Let me, if I may, just express, and it might be an uninformed opinion, but an opinion about that. And Lenny, I want to thank you. When you were speaking, you had an emphasis on our power as citizens in voting. And my understanding is the way the city or the state approves, particularly the state approving verbiage for plaques like that, is it has to go through some historic commission, and all those people are appointees of elected members in the state legislature or the governor. So that makes me think that your statement about voting is another way to potentially tell the truth, to allow the truth to be told more clearly.
Yes.
Well,
In the chat, Suzanne shared with us a link to, if we want to suggest as citizens, something to the Texas Historical Commission to review that. So that's a link we could share, and maybe we could bombard them with our feelings about how they've memorialized our history there.
It was done at the local level.
well, if we are ready to wrap up, I don't want to close us before people get a chance to say what they want to say. But if we are ready to wrap up, I'm going to ask Pastor Craig Hunter if he'd be willing to do a closing prayer for us. So this is kind of the last call, not for drinks, but the last call for questions.
Thank you, Chuck.
Okay. Thank you, Lenny. Thank you to all our presenters. Craig's doing glad
Thank you.
hands.
Yes, thank you to Lenny and Christopher and Chuck and Marcella and Alma and Karen. Thank you all. I'm not seeing any last questions, so let us close in prayer. Loving God, you call us to faithful memory, to remember that we were slaves in Egypt, to remember our own sin and the justice and mercy by which you redeem us from it, to remember that you are with us always, even to the end of the age. As we have remembered this day, part of the history of our own community of Quakertown, enable us to participate with you in the creation of a future that is not limited by the injustices of the past. Strengthen us to do the work of dismantling racism, of making the sacrifices necessary for justice and peace, of building the beloved community to which you call us and for which you create us. In the name of your Son, Jesus Christ, we pray. Amen. Thank you again for putting this together. Thank you all of you for coming, and thanks to our speakers.
Man. Thank you, Chuck. Thank you, Chuck.
Thank you, Ms. Hazel.
Thank you, my friends, and I appreciate everyone coming. We had a good turnout, so that makes me really happy that people are interested.
Oh, yeah.
And thank you for putting up with my my awkwardness.
Thank you, Chuck, and thanks all.
Yeah, thank you all. Thank you.
Yes.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Lenny.
Thank you, Lenny.
You're very
Appreciate
welcome.
you.
Thank you.
Appreciate
Thank
you.
you for being there.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.